Tate Chronicles now transmitting.
Welcome to the Tate Chronicles on Healthcare Now Radio. And now, here's your host, Jim Tate.
Good day, citizens of the free world, from border to border, coast to coast, and to all the ships at sea. I bring you a warm welcome. This is your correspondent, Jim Tate, and thank you for tuning in to the Tate Chronicles. Join me as we cut through the fog that exists at the leading edge of healthcare technology. My guest today is none other than Larry Birch, the CEO of Anju. Anju is a global leader in providing expertise in technology to support clinical trials and really the clinical technology development spectrum. Larry, thanks for joining me on this episode of the Tate Chronicles.
Thanks, Jim. I like being part of the free world. This is great.
Yeah. As the healthcare field searches for appropriate use cases for AI, the topic of clinical trials is frequently mentioned. So let's kind of start there, Larry. From your viewpoint, how does the life science industry trying to use AI or is using AI and machine learning to improve clinical research and clinical trials? And I kind of mentioned those separately. Maybe you can tease out a difference between clinical research and clinical trials for me, and then how AI may be involved.
Well, clinical trials are an offshoot, kind of the last part of clinical research, right? Clinical research includes a lot of preclinical data. Out of, call it 10,000 molecules that are tested, only one, there's only one drug that's approved. And I'm not talking about 10,000 similar molecules. I'm just talking about all the research that happens. There are so many failures in clinical research, and that starts with preclinical animal research and even before that. And so, this is why, and by the way, what that means is that the total cost of failures, right? And then that one winner that occurs might be billions of dollars of investor capital that's spent to get that one drug. That's why I always think it's so interesting, especially politicians that I know better, but they want to, they want to get the populace worked up. But I always want to make sure people understand this. When you have someone who says, this pill costs 5 cents and they charge $5,000, doesn't that seem unfair? Well, it seems unfair, but the 5 cents that you cost to manufacture a pill is the infinitesimal part of the cost of the research that was invested to make that pill efficacious for people. And by the way, those same politicians have correctly created a regulatory structure with the FDA and support organizations like NIH to ensure that we're not selling snake oil in this industry, and that we do have protocols in place. We do use data, prescriptively to ensure that we are constantly improving morbidity and mortality. And so I always find that populist view versus the practical view, and then the confusion that's put into the minds of the people, a little bit perplexing to me. But I'm on a mission, as I think you are, to make sure that there's certainly issues and problems we have in the world, but let's make sure we focus on the right ones.
Well, before we get back to AI, let me ask you a question. So let's say that today I create a medication, the Holy Grail, that will effectively treat Alzheimer's. How long do I have a patent or intellectual property rights on that medication before generics could be created for it?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not a patent lawyer. I think the number is 17 years. I'm close enough with that number. The real issue, though, is that patent timeline, that patent cliff, if you will, starts at the time that you have filed the patent, and you still have maybe 10 years of research. So, as we elongate research, we limit the amount of time with which a patent holder can capture that value. Now, look, it goes back and forth. I don't know what the right number is, but I do think that we need to ensure that drug companies and their investors are incented to develop new drugs. That means that there should be outsized winners to offset the vast numbers of losers in the space.
Okay, let's get back to AI a little bit. And but Anju, are you involved not only in the the process of clinical research, or are you more focused on the latter stages where the clinical trials take place?
So we're much more into clinical trials, but let me very briefly, I'm going to do a commercial, but talk about Anju. So Anju is a life science technology company. We have 3 suites of products. We have a business intelligence tool called TA Scan, and what this does is takes vast amounts of data, publicly available data, and curates that from 100 or so sources, and allows for pharma companies or CROs, sponsors of some kind, to identify patient populations, sites for clinical trials, site quality, site capacity, diverse populations. Diversity is the biggest thing in life sciences today, to identify diverse populations for use in a clinical trial. We have a clinical data solution called TrialMaster. It's eClinical. And what that is really electronic data capture. Along with, in this industry, it's a word salad nobody needs to care about. We call ePro, which is patient-reported outcomes, or CTMS, clinical trial management. So it's a suite of products that help CROs and pharma companies collect, collate, and submit data to the FDA. And then we have a medical affairs platform. And our medical affairs platform helps medical affairs teams within pharma companies create publications. That's one product suite. And the other is query management, whereas inbound queries come from patients to the FDA, to physicians, around a drug that's in the marketplace. They can quickly and easily answer those questions satisfactorily, usually around dosage, usage, maybe a safety issue around that. So those are the 3 suites we have. I think today we'll probably spend more time on clinical research, the first 2 suites that we have, and then how AI is changing things, which, AI is changing everything, and it's going to be, healthcare and life sciences is no different.
And so tell me how AI, and in particular, how the AI platforms you're working with, remove some of the friction, so to speak, in clinical research.
Well, look, so first off, let's make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about, right? AI is really about just finding patterns within data, right? When it comes, that's at the end of the day, that's really what we're doing here, right? We want to improve trial design, any optimization issue. We want to allow for better predictions around patient behavior, drug efficacy, right? And then be able to design more efficient, effective clinical tools for clinical trials, right? And then also identifying the best patients. There's an interesting thing in life sciences. I think you've probably heard of Moore's law, being in tech, right? Moore's law is around doubling speed and the size of circuits. Well, in life science, I don't know who came up with it. I would love to give them credit. It certainly wasn't me. They developed something called Arum's law. And Arum's law, Arum is the reverse of Moore, right? And it says the number of drugs approved in the United States per $1 billion in spend halves every 9 years, right? So clinical trials are getting more costly and frankly taking more time. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I'll leave that up to the folks at NIH and some of it, because my view in the FDA, because I have people who sometimes are frustrated by the FDA and the approval process. I'm not. I'm grateful for the FDA. I'm grateful that we have an organization that is dedicated to ensuring that an industry is not selling snake oil. I like the idea of progression-free disease or improving length of time that people live. If you think about things that have happened in oncology, for instance, it's always progression. A new drug comes in that extends life by 6 months, by 12 months, that replaces the last drug. And there's that incentive to do that. But there's also testing and validation by independent bodies to say this is really good. But that said, it's expensive. So I think there should be and needs to be every tool we could possibly use to improve efficiency and improve the speed. Certainly makes sense, but we have to do it carefully. AI is a great tool, but again, there's a lot of issues with it, which we'll talk about. But right now, just the promise of, before we talked about the issues, think about the promise, not the least of which, and you asked a great question earlier about, clinical research versus clinical trials. Let's talk about clinical research, the preclinical aspect of it. During the pandemic, very interesting. There are a lot of clinical trials associated with pandemic-related COVID drugs. But because of the shutdowns that we faced, right, there was so much impact in clinical research. remember I talked about animal studies. Animal labs were not only shut down, thousands, maybe, I don't know, a lot of animals were put down in that process, right? Because there was no one to take care of those animals. We want to treat them humanely, but they're a critical part of the clinical process. So rebuilding clinical trials today, we're seeing in this generation, it's kind of a post-pandemic hangover, if you will, fewer trial starts because fewer drugs had gone through preclinical during the pandemic, right? It's a journey. And so I think that what we'll see with AI, probably starting with that preclinical research, right? Expanding, kind of miraculously while shrinking the cost materially, right? Because if we can use AI tools, and by the way, maybe a little more humanely, to use less animals, right? I believe in, look, I'm a human, and I eat animals, and I believe in using them for research for sure. But I also believe in the ethical treatment and ensuring that we don't rely only on that if we have other tools. AI might be part of that solution to get to create more data, more efficacious data more quickly, and maybe a little more humanely too. So, and frankly, start this concept of getting clinical trial research into clinical trials in humans, first in human, and let's see if they actually work. So I think AI is going to be very interesting around that. It's really a question of, we could see an exponential volume of clinical research coming out of this, preclinical change, if you think about that, which I'm really excited about.
One thing you mentioned earlier, Larry, was obtaining all this data that's out there and looking for patterns. And let's say maybe a pharmaceutical company is, let's say they're focused on gastrointestinal medications or something like that. And so is there ability with the kind of data you're collecting to help them know, like, geographically and, where there are more folks suffering with this, or areas to pick participants for clinical trials?
Well, you've really hit the next big, big problem of clinical trials, which is, we can talk about using clinical research on the front end, trial design, et cetera. We could skip past that because you're hitting the biggest issue, which is recruitment of patients.
Yes.
Recruiting patients takes 1/3 of the study length is just that. And that's, ka-ching in terms of dollars, but finding those patients. And 1 in 5 clinical trials don't even recruit the required number of people. And by the way, if you don't hit your recruitment timeline, guess what? You have nothing to submit to the FDA, in which case it's wasted effort. So identifying tools to assess, the criteria for participation. And so what you could do, and there are firms doing this isn't us, but, I'm pretty familiar with the industry. I want to see how we fit into the world. But there are firms that are saying, what if we adjusted the criteria for participation? What would that do? And the first thing you have to think about is, what does that do for patient safety? In clinical trial research, patient safety comes first and is paramount to everything that we do. We value data, we value the way the trial is conducted, and to ensure that we never put patients at undue risk. There's risk to everything, but undue risk, right? But what if we were to find that we could maybe change criteria for blood pressure or lymphocyte counts, or a million of other criteria that we use AI to determine through previous research that the safety criteria isn't altered, but by expanding the criteria, we can include more patients into the study. It's a fantastic thing, right? So that's complex stuff, but the idea of being able to do this, we could find there are tools that are doubling the number of eligible patients without increasing a hazard ratio. To me, that's fantastic. And in terms of the tools that we're looking at, in terms of what we do at Anju, and again, I don't want to make a commercial, but identify patient identification through meticulous curation of data from Medicare, from everything, to identify these patient groups, and then we couple that with what's called DCT, decentralized clinical trials, which AI is helping with as well. Which means that what that in essence means is that patients either do not have to go to clinical sites or need to come much less often than in traditional clinical trials. Why do we care about that? Well, look, if you are a patient in Homer, Alaska, and the clinical trial is done in North Carolina, and it's required that you be at the site, guess what? You're not going to be in that clinical trial. But what if I could give you an iPad and wearables? And what if I could design a clinical trial so that I could send you a little briefcase and be able to have you, conduct the clinical research at your house? And by the way, with an iPad, you can immediately contact the nurse if there's some adverse event that's occurring or some question. And in fact, I might argue that's safer than waiting until next Thursday to go to the site, right? If I have instantaneous access to people and I can do it at the comfort of home. And by the way, that also increases compliance, because the next big issue is, let's assume that I've identified a patient. Let's assume that they meet my criteria. Let's assume that they agree to participate. Well, now, how do I keep them in the trial?
Exactly.
The trial might last a year or 2 years. The trial,
Exactly.
it's a big inconvenience for people. So AI tools, some of the most basic chatbots, for example, really allowing people to be engaged, right? Engagement with patients is really critical. I know with your background in terms of a clinical setting, right? But it's also true in a clinical trial setting, which is patient engagement, making sure that they understand what's happening, what to expect, what types of side effects they might be facing and how we deal with them effectively, what the promised land of what could happen at the end of the trial in terms of improving their disease state. All those things are enhanced with the idea of AI tools and, of course, the machine learning that goes with it. It's an exciting time. There's no doubt.
Let me mention to our listeners, if you're just joining us, I'm Jim Tate, and on this episode of the Tate Chronicles, I'm speaking with Larry Birch, the CEO of Anju. One thing that you mentioned there that we hear more and more about, again, kind of talking about the clinical trials, there's a history of clinical trials of algorithmic bias, for lack of a better term. Getting maybe the easiest participants to be in a trial, which may not represent the intended users of a medication. And so if you may start out with a representative group of folks in a clinical trial, but if you have some dropouts somewhere along the line, you're not going to be, you're going to be increasing the chance of that algorithmic bias. So it's interesting to hear what you say about the way to keep participants involved and in the trial. Absolutely.
Well, the bias happens before, during, and after clinical trials. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you have bias, I have bias. I teach leadership and strategy at a graduate school here in Chicago, and I have a whole lecture on the 25 different types of biases we all deal with. Welcome to the human race, right? The human mind establishes patterns, and we try to act on those to separate all the incoming data fields. There's nothing wrong with bias. The problem with bias is to recognize it. Right. The problem is what conclusions am I reaching based on that bias, and am I using real data, or am I being skewed somehow by events or some experience that's one off? And that's how humans interact. And by the way, AI by its very nature is mimicking that. So clearly, we have to be very concerned about what the implications are to bias in AI models, right? And by the way, with AI models, because where's the data input coming from? Biased human beings, right? And so why would we expect that AI is going to self-correct for that? It's not. We need to be very aware of that. And the thing to think about here is, and by the way, the other problem with AI, especially, is sometimes the data is hard to reproduce. So now reproduction of data is a really different thing too. It adds a whole level of complexity. But at the end of the day, in my mind, it's about trust. First off, I think when we're talking to patients, talking to regulators, talking to anyone, we need to make sure that we are transparent, right? What are our fears? What do we know? What don't we know? What are the classic known knowns, known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, right? In terms of how we're doing it, where are we looking for to improve trust and validation? Are we open to the fact that we may have made a mistake? Are we true to our heart around what we mean in terms of how do we eliminate bias? Taking into account these human faculties, which is what the humans do with AI, right? If we get the right humans. AI doesn't use common sense, intuition, their medical training. Humans do. So we can improve that trust this is not about eliminating the human involvement. It's about augmenting the human involvement with technology. And so from my mind, but if we aren't really very, very careful, right, we could find ourselves, with the unintended consequence, right? I'm a very optimistic person. I do not believe that bias, that people go into research with the idea of helping a certain group or hurting another group.
Sure.
I do believe it occurs by accident. And so to me, it's about awareness to look for those patterns. Look, we've seen it with AI in criminal justice. You could see it with healthcare as well. Different populations in different places. Let's just start with clinical research in a way. 98% or something or I should say 2% of the population is near 98% of the research centers, right? Because the research centers are typically academic, which are in large cities. Mm-hmm. And when you look at where those folks are, let's look at socioeconomics. Close to those facilities are usually people, oftentimes Caucasian, white, oftentimes a little wealthier, right? How do we ensure that we aren't creating drugs that only support that population? What should we do? Well, certainly not that, right? Again, that's why decentralized clinical trials should grab in a larger group of the population. What is the disease state? If you look at triple negative breast cancer, what are we doing to support that? But in this instance, that flips the idea upside down. The vast majority of patients with triple negative breast cancer are South Asian or African descent, right? There are geographic, racial components to disease states that need to be explored to ensure that we want to make sure that we magnify those populations within the clinical trial setting to ensure that we're helping the populations that are most impacted. So this bias works both ways, and the bias needs to be constantly evaluated, and that's why diversity tools, and I will pitch us a little bit. We have a fantastic diversity tool with our business intelligence tool to really ensure that we are helping pharma companies cross that chasm to ensure that we are helping the maximum amount of people correctly, right? And again, it starts with trust, it starts with transparency. And to the extent that we can do that, we're going to be a better society for sure. And by the way, make people live longer lives, healthier. I love it.
Larry, Anju, so who are your customers? Pharmaceutical companies, clinical research organizations, university, health systems, all the above?
I'm going to hire you in my marketing team. That's it. We have some of the largest academic institutions in the world that use our software, along with a variety of pharma companies, large and small, and of course, CROs represent about half of clinical development. So our CRO partners are very, very important to us in terms of how we help them collect data.
I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Research Triangle Park, and there's certainly a lot of clinical trials and development work going on right here by major pharmaceutical companies. We only have a couple more minutes, but first let me ask you this. What do you see as the potential future for AI and clinical research?
Well, look, the issue is going to be like everything else. What I find particularly exciting and a little discomforting is hype.
Yes.
We're seeing a lot of hype in this, and fortunately, I don't think a regulated industry like life sciences is going to be leading the AI charge, right? AI will be in less risky areas, and then we will adapt them, after they've been tested. But I look at the things around, especially it's everything, unfortunately, for better or worse, our society is based on people chasing dollars, right? And so, so hype is certainly valuable in motivating investors to take a position, to invest capital, to advance these tools. But like all hype, I get concerned about is the expectation about those valuations going to be so high that we create a bubble, or is the expectation, especially when it comes to science? Look, science moves slowly, and it should, right? We want to be very careful. And so what I'm concerned about is I don't want the hype of AI to spur some issue around. I love the fact that it's faster and cheaper. That's fantastic, right? What we don't want to do is sacrifice safety, sacrifice the quality of data, sacrifice the efficacy of the performance of the drug based on that data, right? So we want to make sure that we set the right perspective for investors. We want the capital in order to innovate. But we want to make sure they understand there's a rigorous process of expanding human knowledge, right? And this idea of understanding, and the peer review associated with these things all take time, and maybe longer than in other industries that will use AI. I will say, on the other hand, that for those patient investors, their returns, especially in life sciences, will likely be outsized, right? Will be fantastic. But I think it's, the word hype is a negative connotation. And Jim, I think you'd agree it should, right? Because that, that creates the ebbs and flows, the booms and busts. And this is life sciences. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about how we do things with rigor, how we engage patients in a trustful way. And so that trust is to be earned over time. And as you also know, right, trust can be shot and wasted very quickly.
Absolutely.
I want to make sure we don't find ourselves in that position of violating the trust of the patients who we're trying to help. And so I think AI is a fantastic tool, a set of tools. I think there are some great companies. We'd love to have another hour to talk about the companies that are doing such amazing things in terms of driving life sciences. But I will say this, if for the listeners, I've been in this industry a long time. I know a lot of folks in it. I want people to understand that I'm so confident. I'm not a researcher. I don't, we're helping these guys, but I'm so inspired by how everyone in this industry is so focused on the concept of improving lives, improving morbidity, improving mortality. That is our agenda, and you know this from on your side of this as well. And so we're going to be careful, and we're going to do it right, and we're going to make some mistakes. But we're going to do it right.
That goes back to Hippocrates: first, do no harm.
Correct.
Final question for you, Larry: how can our listeners find out more about Anju's services and products? Where do they go?
Well, www.anjusoftware.com. I'm Larry Birch. I'm Laurence Birch. Easy to find on LinkedIn. Link in with me and ask any question you want and anything we can do to help. And look, whether it's related to Anju Software for sure, but you know what? This is a small community and a small world, and I love to pay it forward. And if there's anything I can do to help anyone that's listening, I will certainly do so.
Great. Well, thank you for that. To our audience, thanks for joining me on this episode of the Tate Chronicles, and certainly I offer a special salute to my guest today, Larry Birch of Anju. Larry, thanks for coming aboard today.
Thank you very much. I'll say it again. I'm excited to live in a free America. I love the way you laid that out. That was fantastic. You're a great guy. I appreciate all the work you're doing for explaining life sciences and healthcare to the world. I think it's great. Thank you.
Thank you. You can find more information on this show's program page at healthcarenowradio.com. That's healthcarenowradio.com. Until we meet again, here's wishing you smooth sailing and safe harbors.
Tate Chronicles transmission ending now.